Hey guys, welcome to my studio. Really happy you could join me. My name is Sarah Yeoman. This is my new watercolor tutorial. Here's the chapters that I'm going to cover and the palette that I use with the names of the colors on it. I don't use all of them in this video, but I'll talk about the colors as I go. These are the brushes that I'm going to be using. It's mostly all flat brushes, Robert Simmons, and a couple of Viscoda Perlas. Here's the image that I'm going to be working from in the color, and then the grayscale. The next thing we're going to take a look at is how to make your paper proportional to your photo reference. First, we're going to place the photo in the lower left-hand corner of the paper, lining up the edges vertically and horizontally. Going to take a straight edge and line it up corner to corner on your photograph. And then anywhere along that line, your paper will be the same proportion as your photo. So make the mark with a pencil, and then cut or tear the paper or tape it. Now that our paper is the same proportion as our photo, we're going to grid the photo and the paper, measure the halfway point on the photo vertically and horizontally and draw the lines, and then we're going to do the same on the paper. And by the way, I'm using Arch's 140-pound cold press. We're going to draw very lightly with the pencil, and I originally just put a single mark each direction, and then I'll put the line in. And now we're ready to start transferring our drawing to the Arches paper, looking at the photograph, and again we have the same proportion with our grids, and it just gives you help finding out where those lines and shapes need to be placed in your composition. It's like giving yourself a road map. And as I lay down these lines and shapes, I'm not thinking about named things, but just shape next to shape. Not drawing mountains, not drawing trees, just getting these forms in. Large shapes to small, light values to dark. And I'm using a Statler lead holder. I believe this is a 2B lead. And I have a whole bunch of these lying around. They're really nice because you never have to sharpen them. And if you have a bunch of them, you don't have to spend a lot of time looking for them. So the first part of our exercise is going to be about doing a value study. And we're going to work from our grayscale photograph, which just means it's turned into a black and white photo. These next series of photos are from the original, and it's just two values, light and dark. And again, light and dark, and it just shows you the variation that you can have just in light and dark. This next value sketch from the photograph is three values, so light, medium, and dark. Sometimes I do these with pigment, but I also use grayscale markers. These are brand new. These are the Tombow brush markers, and then I also use Prismacolor. And here's some value studies done with these in my Stillman and Byrne sketchbook, and these just are a great tool to do when you're first starting to figure out what your composition is going to be. So we have our drawing done. I'm wetting the back of the paper and also wetting the front of the paper. And I wet it for a couple minutes. I really want it to get saturated. Let it sit for a few minutes and then I'll just wipe off a little bit around the edges and take the excess off. So I'm mixing my Payne's Gray and some neutral tint. I just happened to have both of them on the palette when I was doing this demo, so I kind of used both of them, but you can use either one you want to. Indigo might be a really nice idea, or perylene green, sepia, burnt umber, whatever floats your boat you can use. And I like Payne's Gray and neutral tint kind of equally, so anyway, when we do wet and wet, the paper is already wet, so we don't need as much water in our mixtures. If you add too much water, you're going to get, all the blooming and the cauliflowers or whatever we call them. So I'm very aware of the amount of pigment that I'm using, and I very gradually build it up. And this layer takes a little bit of time to get on. And I always work the whole paper when I'm doing wet and wet. I don't just work in one area. So adding some stronger pigment now with my flat brush. And notice how I use the brush. I'll pull it up from the bottom of the shape to deepen the value. And also use the brush on the side. And some darker value on that mid-ground shape, which makes the area above it appear light. And establishing value in the foreground shape. Really starts to have a sense of depth now. and a little more value in that mid-ground shape. Remember, we're working from large shapes to small, light value to dark value. And look what those little bits of dark do. They start to push that shape further back. And then you can really start to see the depth in that background. Now doing some lifting with my flat brush. And each time I lift the pigment, I wipe it on my paper towel, because if you don't do that, you're just going to put the paint right back on the piece of paper. I'm doing a little lifting with a flat brush, and I'm going to take my spray bottle and give it a little spritz just to re-wet that surface a little bit. Keeps it workable for a longer period of time. And I'm just going to let this go to music for a little while, so I'm sure you're tired of hearing me talk. So see you at the next demo. So here's the finished painting. I'm really happy with the result. I like the texture. It's got really nice light going on. I might have done a little bit too much, but I couldn't help myself. So now here's the color photograph that we're going to do our next painting of. This is up in the Adirondacks in upstate New York, where my family has a summer house where I've spent many summers. And this is a place I love to paddle. So we started with getting the drawing done, and I wet the back of the paper. Again, wet it for a few minutes, and then wet the front of the paper, and then wipe off the excess water. And just as a reminder, here's the palette that I use, and I'll talk about the colors that I use as I go through the demo. It's not actually that many colors, it's a fairly limited palette. So here's a little bit of cobalt blue, my favorite color, I think, and some cerulean blue, my second favorite color, I'm pretty sure, and my large flat brush. And remember, the paper is already nice and wet. We've taken the extra water off of it though, and I'm just using that nice broad stroke, getting that pigment everywhere, really just getting rid of the white paper. And mixing the pigment a little stronger now. Do you see the change in that value? So that just means the ratio of pigment to water has changed. So there's a little more paint in the mixture and not as much water. Same two colors. And getting that same blue in the foreground. And here's a little yellow ochre. Dirty yellow ochre, it looks like. That's okay. And adding a little bit of cerulean blue to this mixture. Just a little deeper. Back to the palette, and cobalt blue, cerulean blue, still the same couple colors, yellow ochre. So it's a little bit stronger mixture of that green. Still needs a little more weight to it. There we go. I think I added a little bit of cadmium yellow to that. You can see the strength of that. So a little stronger pigment now. And look at all the different ways I use this brush. You can pull a shape like a vertical shape like that. And I just added a little bit of blue to that. And then kind of this feather stroke where you can pull it sideways and end up with those really nice soft edges. A little darker value there. And some more cerulean and cobalt down on the right hand side, deepening the water in the foreground. Just establishing shape and value. No things, just shape and value. And then back to the palette. This is a little bit of sap green and a little bit of cadmium yellow because I want something with a little more punch to it. Yellow ochre, cobalt. And I work until I get the color I want. I take the time and really try to figure out what color I'm looking for because I don't always know. A little ultramarine blue in there. There it goes. Nice neutral kind of teal color. It's not quite blue, it's not quite green. Just establishing that background mass with the midtone. They're still very light midtones. I'm just going to deepen that mountain shape in the back a little bit. It's just a little too light. Watercolor dries 30% lighter than how we put it on, so you have to always keep that in mind. I knew that shape would just disappear once it started to dry a bit. Adding a little stronger value in here, and that's just the same color combination, just a little more ultramarine blue in there, and less water, more paint in the mixture. And do you see as you put that dark in how the lights start to show up a little bit? Working on that mid-ground a little bit. That's a bit of brown matter in there, just to add a little bit of warmth to play against those greens. And back to the palette, ultramarine blue. Same colors that I've been using. There's not a whole lot of change in the colors. Sap green, Payne's gray. And the paint is getting a little bit heavier now. It's more like a cream consistency. And just notice how I use that brush. You see I'm using just the edge of it to get really beautiful fine lines. And then you can turn the tip and just get these lovely little suggestions of the branches on those pines that are up there. Laying in some pigment in that foreground now. That's just the cobalt blue, cerulean blue. Probably has a little bit of the ultramarine blue in it just to deepen it a little bit. Using the edge of that brush to get some line in there. And mixing a little bit more of a saturated green in that midground for the bottom of that landmass. And look how beautiful that dark is. It makes the light start to show up. And the paper's still a little damp, so you get those lovely soft edges. So it gives that the suggestion of three-dimension. Back to the small flat. Starting to work on some smaller shapes. Remember, we're working from large shapes to small, from light value to dark values. And cleaning up a couple of those edges in that midground where the water meets the land. And because it's still damp, I can take that flat brush and pull back to the white of the paper. It did have a little bit of yellow that had kind of seeped into that, but I love that I can find that edge again and that you can bring the light back out. You can reveal the light, which I just find so exciting about this technique. And then lifting with the flat brush. It's just a little heavy back in there, so I'm just pulling out some shapes. Don't really know what they're going to be. I'm just finding some light so that I can come back in and paint behind them to create form. And some darker value in here. I went back to my palette and mixed a little bit more of that same dark that I had mixed earlier with the ultramarine and Payne's gray, sap green. And I just used my Holbein spray bottle on the surface. It was starting to get a little bit dry. So I'm able to continue to layer that nice dark paint on there because it's a little bit damp again, so I don't get any hard edges. And I'm just taking a little bit of lavender and popping it into the wet areas on the top of those trees, and it kind of melts into that wet paint and really gives it some atmosphere. And back to the palette, ultramarine blue, sap green, Payne's gray, the usual suspects, making that beautiful deep teal color. A little cobalt turquoise light. That kind of makes it a little more neutral, a little smokier. And back to the palette, here's a little bit of cadmium orange. It's a little dirty. Probably a little bit of yellow ochre in there as well. Cadmium red. There's a little yellow ochre too. And then I'm going to grab a little brown madder, which is one of my favorite colors. And this is a little bit of the cadmium orange on my 1/2 inch flat. Just putting a couple pops of warm in here to kind of play against that green. And I'll go back in and lift a few of them here and there. Just trying to establish some of them in there. And a little more value in the back, and I apologize for that glare again. But these brushes are so good at just putting in texture just where you need it. Just reestablish that vertical line there. And then little touches of suggestions of stray branches. And I'm going to do a little bit of lifting with the flat brushes in that foreground just to suggest the motion of the water and the reflections in the water. So back to my larger Robert Simmons, and remember, pull that paint out of the brush each time you lift like that into a clean paper towel. Otherwise you just distribute the pigment right back on the surface. And I'll pull another swipe through there. That's much better. I'm liking the way that looks now. And back to the palette, same combo of colors, ultramarine blue, sap green. This is a little teeny bit of ultramarine violet in there. I love mixing a little bit of purple in with sap green. It neutralizes this dark very nicely. It's still a nice deep teal. And I never use just a black. I always mix my darks. A little more ultramarine, a little more Payne's gray. Because we still have to get some nice dark in that background. So painting the negative space in those background forms to make the light on that midground show up so that there's a layer in between that mid form and those dark trees in the back. So that gives that sense of depth into that area. So this about wraps it up. I think I'm done. This was supposed to just be a test, but I really enjoy what I ended up with. So I want to thank everybody for joining me. And if you have any questions, contact me through my website, www.sarahyeoman.com. And I'm going to be trying to do a video every 10 days or so, so keep an eye out. And hope you all enjoyed it. And stay safe out there, my friends. Lots of love. Bye.